has a lot of importance. And so I thought I would start this session by first putting up a picture of a painting, actually, a Chinese painting. And I thought it would be a good introduction to the nature of abstract writing, because an abstract is an abstraction. It's part of something else. It's a part taken from something else, just as an abstract is a part of a paper or a presentation for a conference or for a publication in a journal. So it's got this partial sort of nature to it. But at the same time, the written abstract is very precise writing, and in fact, it's almost mathematical in a way. And so, and when you look at this image, that's why I chose this particular image, you can see both realistic and non-realistic or impressionistic features. And so I thought that was a good way to kind of begin to get our minds wrapped around the abstract. Can everybody see that? Okay, great. So I thought I would start with a little background. Who wrote the first abstract? I'm pretty sure that the idea of the abstract, at least, has been around for a long time, probably since the time of the ancient Greeks, and definitely during the Middle Ages. Most likely, the Arab scholars in medieval Islam and the Jewish scholars of the diaspora were very busy, like this fellow here, summarizing, classifying, referencing all of the very huge books that they produced and circulated in that time period. And then, of course, in the Renaissance, which is the flowering of scholarship, at least in Europe, scholars and editors and writers were summarizing the contents of many books and articles passionately. So intellectual history, at least in the Western world, but not exclusively in the Western world, is filled with the kind of scholarship that we take for granted. It's so easy for us to go to databases or to libraries. But this is where it all began in this manner here. But we don't see the abstract that we're familiar with until relatively modern times. And I came across this quote when I was reading a book called Communicating Science. And I had no idea that it was a fairly, again, the form that we know is a fairly recent development. So here's the quote. In a 1920 editorial, G.C. Fulcher instructed prospective contributors to the Astrophysical Journal that, quote, every article, however short, is to be preceded by an abstract prepared by the author and submitted with the manuscript, end quote. And then in a subsequent article in Science, 1921, he encouraged other scientific publications to follow suit because abstracts, quote, save much time for the scientist, not only as a reader of current literature, but also as an investigator, end quote. Today, because of Fulcher's encouragement and the evolutionary fitness of heading such abstracts in the scientific article, they are as ubiquitous as figures and tables. So thanks to Fulcher, whoever this guy was, the abstract became an everyday facet of scholarly life. And so today I thought I would try to limit my remarks to the conference abstract, but most of what applies to the abstract for conferences applies to getting an abstract published in a journal. And there's some key differences, of course. The format is different, but the skills and the rigor that is involved for both situations applies to both of them. Most abstracts for conferences are not indexed. You can find some of them on the internet, but it's a little difficult to find those, whereas everything that is published in a journal, an abstract for a paper, will be indexed, and those are very easy to find. So a question for you guys. What's your definition of an abstract? Let me start with Sarah. What would be your definition, Sarah?
I would say a summary of the contents of whatever you're presenting, be it a publication or a poster or an oral presentation.
Okay. Other people? What do you think? Anybody want to stick their neck out? To me, it's something that takes a long time to write.
We were just discussing on the Fort Hays campus that those are the hardest part of a manuscript to write. And it's usually the last part that I write because it's a summary of the entire manuscript.
That's right.
And I think for beginning authors, it's by far the hardest part to learn because it's so concise and so dense.
That's right. Very good. Anybody else? So if Sarah and Fort Hays say summary. Somebody threw their hands up. I don't know. Hi. Yes, a famous French writer said, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have enough time. It's the short things that seem to be really hard to write. Well, it's not exactly a summary. Not exactly. It is a very self-contained, yes, definitely, very short, absolutely, and powerful statement, I would say, that is describing a larger work. I think the word description is kind of the key idea here. It is definitely not a review, like a movie review or a music review. It doesn't really evaluate the presentation, the conference presentation, or the paper for publication. It doesn't evaluate it, you know, like this is what it's worth or anything like that. The abstract should contain the key words that are found in the larger work, the paper or the presentation. But the abstract really is an original document. So a lot of the students in the doctoral program that come to the Writing Center, whether they're writing a capstone project or a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation, oftentimes their abstract is a copy and paste of phrases and words and sentences from their introduction. That's not what an abstract is. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that might get them in hot water, depending on their committee. An abstract really is an original, and that's what makes it so hard. It's like trying to write a poem after reading a novel, a poem about the novel. It has to be something that is a part of, rather than an excerpt from. And its purpose really is to tell others, you know, what you've done and why you've done it, or what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. So I would say it's a bare bones version of the larger work, but there has to be enough meat on that version in order to communicate effectively to people. And indeed, it's the first thing, whether it's published in a journal or whether it's published on the internet before a conference proceeding begins, it's the first thing that people see. And it's certainly the first thing that the selection committee of a conference will see, and they'll make the decision whether to accept or reject your project based on your abstract. So, you know, I've already mentioned there are, like, you know, 2 occasions or situations when you write an abstract for a conference, for a journal, but there's also 2 other situations or occasions. So you've already got the paper written, as we heard from Fort Hays, and now you try to say, what did I just do in this project? And that's what most of us do. Most writers are using their abstract to create this description and to get published for their paper. And the other time you write an abstract is when you haven't yet written your project or given your presentation. Why would you write, and this is what people do, why would you write an abstract before you've actually done your presentation or your paper? Has anyone been in that position? Seems kind of counterintuitive, but this is the way writers proceed. Yes?
If you don't yet know what you're going to write on, perhaps you start with an abstract to better define and explore what you're going to write about and try to find out what to write about in a better way.
Absolutely. Well put. I mean, what writing the abstract, putting the cart before the horse does is to clarify your thinking. And what you put it really well. It really helps you to move your project from inception to development to completion. And that path is often a nightmare for researchers. And having as clear an idea as possible at the outset is really, really important. So abstracts can force you, yes, really force you to think clearly about the project that lies ahead. And it really can help make possible the decisions that will lead to the successful realization of that project. So I think that, you should always entertain the prospect of writing or trying to write the abstract before you create your project, before you undertake your research project. And I'll talk a little bit more about the writing process here in a minute, but I wanted to sort of throw out one cautionary fact. Now, this is kind of old evidence, but in 2003, there was a study that showed of all the abstracts that were accepted at US conferences and annual meetings, this was in 2003, of all of those, only 45% were ultimately published as papers in journals. So less than half of all the abstracts accepted at all of the conferences, less than half actually turned into publications. The other 55% remained unfinished, as far as we know. Now, that's a kind of startling statistic. I can only hope that in the last 14 years, the percentages have gotten better for writers. But I think while there are many reasons why writers don't get the job done, I think it's really important to think about how much time and effort that really does go into a project. And so for me, the underlying lesson here is you really need to choose something that you are truly passionate about, something that will keep you motivated throughout all of the nightmarish and difficult stages of research, something that will energize you rather than drain you. So to me, that's the takeaway from reading this statistic about success and failure of abstracts. There are two main types in the largest sense possible. The informative, which is also called the complete, and the descriptive, which is also called the indicative. So the informative abstract does not critique or evaluate, but acts as a kind of surrogate for the work itself. It presents and explains main arguments or findings. It includes background, purpose, method, scope, results, and/or conclusion. Sometimes it will have labeled sections, and that's what's called a structured, also called a structured abstract: background, aim, method, results, conclusion, discussion. And usually this type of abstract is somewhere between 100 and 200 words, but it varies depending on the discipline and depending on the context, a journal or the conference. The second type is called the descriptive or indicative. And it really does indicate the type of information that is in the article or the presentation for the conference. Like the informative, it doesn't critique or evaluate, but it also doesn't provide results or conclusions because it's concerned with describing. It doesn't really delve into substance. It incorporates keywords found in the text. So in this way, it really is kind of like a table of contents. When you look at a book and you open the table of contents and you read the chapters, That's what this one is kind of like. That's how it's descriptive. And it may include purposes, methods, scope of research, but again, it's in a really kind of an outline form rather than a summary. And this one tends to be very short and concise, about 100 words or less. So those are the two main types. There are variations, you know, again, depending on the science or the specialty, but these are for the most part the really large categories of abstracts. Which type do you use? Right. Most times the conference is going to determine that for you. They will have very specific guidelines and specifications for you to follow. And in that sense, it makes it easier to write the abstract. But if the conference does not provide guidelines, and a lot of them don't, then I suggest you consult an advisor or a faculty member or somebody who has been to conferences before, because I think their experience can be very important, maybe even crucial. The veteran researchers can really be useful to help you write a conference for an abstract for a conference or a meeting, especially if this is for your first time. In retrospect, I think I would have definitely gone to former teachers to ask for help when I did go to conferences. I think it would have made things a lot smoother for me, and I think for a lot of people as well. I think you should always, when you're considering submitting an abstract to a conference, or again, even to a publication, study the abstracts that are part of the track record for that conference or that publication. This will give you a very good idea of what a good abstract looks like. Again, they'll all differ, again, depending on the topic, but they will give you a good perspective of the format and the type of writing that you should be striving for. But in any case, always consider your options, right? Will your project ultimately be a scientific paper to be submitted to a journal? Will your project be results driven? Will it be theoretical? I mean, all of these questions, I think, are very relevant in terms of how you write your abstract and getting it accepted, which takes time. I mean, sometimes there are some conferences that will take up to almost a year before you hear back from them, almost close to the time of the actual meeting, and others that will inform you right away. So it's all over the map in terms of that. But it's a very important stage in the life cycle of a research project, getting an abstract accepted for a conference or for publication. So all of these are the very key questions, key ideas to entertain. Okay, so now I want to talk about preparing to write a abstract. Really start with the ABCs. Really start at the kindergarten level. And kindergartners are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. The 5 W's and the 1 H, I think, are very good questions that all researchers have to ask when they start a project. Each question should have a factual answer, but it's very important that as a researcher, that none of these answers be simply yes or no. If they're just yes or no answers to the questions, that's not research, or that's minimalist research. These questions have to be something a lot more than just yes or no. And you know, the 5 W's and the H have been around again since antiquity, which again tells us that the great problem-solving approach has got a long history and a long tradition. So here's what an abstract needs from my perspective. Let's take these one at a time. An abstract needs to have a big picture problem or topic. So what have you got started on in this project? What's the topic? What's being debated in your field, right? So this is part of the introduction or the background that is very essential here. it's part of the aim of the study. According to one scholar, a legitimate scientific study is not done to prove something is true, but rather to prove whether or not it's true, to find out whether or not it's true. Can you see the distinction here? Not to prove that something is true, but to find out whether or not it's true. So if you're just trying to prove that something's true, then you've got a personal investment in it, right? And that's not objective or scientific. But if you are trying to put forth a hypothesis or a theory that say this might be true or this could be true, that's the legitimate approach to the first part of this list of necessary steps. This is the approach that I think the reader is going to focus on when reading your abstract. So how much background do you give, right? That's another important question. The second thing, hypothesis or approach. And then the third thing, an abstract needs a gap or gaps in the literature on a specific topic. So what have you found in your research that is worth presenting, and what does it mean? This can be part of the background. Oftentimes it is, but not necessarily. An abstract then needs to fill the gaps or gap in the on the topic, right? This is the method. It has to be a concisely written method. In your abstract, many details are going to be left out, and oftentimes it feels like you're gutting the details in an abstract. But again, here's the rigor of the form. Some of the important questions, though, are going to be about whether the study you're conducting or will conduct is retrospective or prospective or randomized, and so on and so forth. Right? All of that probably needs to be specified, especially if there are patients or other human subjects that are involved in the study. And there needs to be some specific material that is examined. Again, is it a randomly selected sample? Is it a consecutive series sample? Is it a convenient sample? Those are the kinds of materials that need to be specified in an abstract. Then the results of the investigation. What did you find from carrying out the study? Findings that are related to hypotheses have to be in the form of actual data. So here's the part, and I'll show you some examples where you will see raw data presented in the abstract. And even if there are no real statistical significant differences found, there still needs to be some hard data here. One or two sentences at the most. You'll see this here in the examples. And then a strong conclusion, right? Sometimes in some abstracts this is called implications, but it's a brief statement of why the major findings are important. So the findings support the conclusion, and the conclusion supports the finding. So you have to consider very carefully your conclusions in the context of your findings. So if a study was restricted to just certain patients, right, as opposed to multiple populations of patients, or if it was restricted to just one kind of therapy or intervention as opposed to others, maybe one drug as opposed to many drugs, all of that stuff is very important in terms of your conclusion. And so the significance might not extend beyond those circumstances. And a good title. I mean, titles are very important, even in scientific writing. I would say especially in scientific writing, titles are very important. It's the first thing someone's going to read when they read the abstract, although it might be the last thing that you write after you write your abstract. So you need to think about, the contents of your abstract and of your project before you give your abstract a title. Most of the best titles that I have seen in abstracts, whether they're for conferences or journal publications, have some kind of a take-home message. It seems like the standard length is going to be anywhere up to 10 or 12 words. If it starts getting longer than that, I think then you're putting a lot of demands on the reader's patience. It might be a potential turnoff for them. So what words should the title include? I definitely would not put the results of my study in my title. I wouldn't try to summarize my results in my title. I would try again to find some kind of descriptive language about the design or the goals of the study. I think those are the most important things, and definitely jargon should be left out. I think editors and the heads of selection committees do not like jargon in the titles of abstracts, because again, the abstract is working differently than the actual paper or the actual presentation. And definitely I would say avoid using non-specific language like a study of, an investigation into. They consider that redundant because the study is a study. The research project is an investigation. So you want a title that really wears well, that researchers will find 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years, just like you guys right now, looking through all of the databases and looking at titles and abstracts. Okay, so here's a few examples. And I chose these examples because they have something to do with writing or with abstracts themselves. And I numbered each sentence here in this first one so you could see the moves that the writer is making here. This is a real interesting paper from 2007. I'll just go through this real briefly. Self-citation, those where authors cite their own works, account for a significant portion of all citations. So there's our opening move. These self-citations may result from the cumulative nature of individual research, the need for personal gratification, or the value of self-citation as a rhetorical and tactical tool in the struggle for visibility and scientific authority. Third move. In this article, we examine the incentives that underlie citation by studying how authors' references to their own works affect the citations they receive from others. So that's original. We report the results of a macro study of more than 500,000 citations to articles by Norwegian scientists that appeared in the Science Citation Index. We show, so notice also the tenses they're using, past tense, present tense. We show that the more one cites oneself, the more one is cited by other scholars. Controlling for numerous sources of variation and cumulative citation from others, our models suggest that each additional self-citation increases the number of citations from others by about 1 after 1 year and by about 3 after 5 years. Moreover, there is no significant penalty for the most frequent self-citers. The effect of self-citation remains positive even for very high rates of self-citation. So the more you love yourself, the better it is, I guess. These results carry important policy implications for the use of citations to evaluate performance and distribute resources in science, and they represent new information on the role and impact of self-citation in scientific communication. So this is a good one to study and analyze, again, in terms of the moves and in terms of other things, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. So that's the first example. And I kind of also, put these examples up for you to entertain something at the end of this presentation. I'll give you as a kind of a tip, a kind of something you can do for your own benefit. So here's an article, an abstract of an article about how the instructions for writing the abstracts, can these result in better abstracts? I won't read this one, but you can see, so here's the structured abstract with the labels: context, objective, design, mean outcome measure, results, and conclusions. And you can see, again, in that results section, there's the hard data. So that's what I was referring to just a moment ago. Again, even if the data is not showing highly significant differences or anything like that, this type of abstract, there's the need for the reader to see what that data is how it fits into the study. So this one's also very interesting. And then I just put up this, which I found in the book, which kind of gives an anatomy of an abstract that was accepted for presentation. And again, you can see how the diagram shows, again, the different parts and the interrelationship of the parts of the abstract. This is a fairly long abstract of a journal article. And it also, some abstracts will come with tables or figures, but not a whole lot of them do. Again, it depends on the discipline. So let me talk a little bit about how you get started with the abstract. But first, let me mention some guidelines here. So these are the 13 most essential points that I can offer, and there are probably a lot more, but I think these are the most important. So abstracts have to capture a reader's interest. So again, you know this when you're researching your own projects and you're going through data. You've got to find something that really is of interest to you. So the titles are important. You've got to use good grammar, mechanics, word choice, all of that stuff. You have to tell the reader what the project is about and to show why they should read it. And that showing, again, puts a lot of the onus on you as a writer to be very effective and efficient. So the title and abstract have to match. A lot of abstracts get rejected because there is a mismatch. You have to make sure the topic and the research match together. You have to explain what the procedure is going to be, what was done and how, and explain the value of the findings. Who will they be of use to? Description of the work, summarization of the findings, staying within the word limit, and selecting keywords that reflect the content. I'm going to come back to this aspect here in a minute because it's very important. So you always have to ask yourself over and over as you're working on a draft of an abstract, is this good enough to be accepted? That's a really important question as you're working through it. And to remember that the conference abstract is published first by itself. It's a standalone thing. And so therefore it must be very readable and self-contained. Now, here's some techniques for getting started. So it's really essential to know the subject well. So a lot of the students, again, or residents that come to the Writing Center, maybe at a very preliminary stage of their research collection, and they're trying to work through things, and it may actually take them to hitting the books a little bit longer and a little bit deeper in order to actually successfully write an abstract because they just don't know the subject as well enough. So much of it depends on the topic and what you're going to find out there in the literature. But it is really essential to know as much as you can about the research topic. And because conferences want really original studies, they don't want to see rehashings of old work. And part of the criteria, the really essential criteria, how does this add to our knowledge? So again, get started by reading these abstracts from previous conferences. You can try free writing before you do anything, before you outline, before you make notes. You can try free writing as a warm-up. But free writing simply means you try to write whatever you think about without having to look at articles or books. Just based upon your own knowledge and experience, you just try to write for 15 minutes on a piece of paper, on a blank file, everything that you think about, that you know about a topic. It really is a kind of like stream of consciousness writing. I call it dumping because basically you're just trying to empty your brain onto the paper or onto the screen to just see what you've got to work with. And I've been having my students use this kind of technique to get started with their projects for the last 20 years. And many have said really surprising things to me, like it's very therapeutic, it helped me calm down, it really opened up avenues that I didn't know were there in terms of ideas and connections. That's the most important thing to me about free writing, is that it helps you see connections. They're already there in your mind, but sometimes it's very challenging to try to see them clearly, or do the traditional outlining. When you are ready to start drafting, what you should do with the abstract is to take each element, the background, the method, the results, and try to work each element, write it up alone, and to try multiple versions of each thing. I think it's very helpful when you have a conclusion A and then a conclusion B, and then to compare the two. And oftentimes what that will do is spark conclusion C, which is either a synthesis of the two, or it's a totally new version of one that you actually have been looking for. So there are lots of little things that you can do as writers to help you achieve success. And don't agonize over this stuff. Abstract this stuff. That's the really key thing. So I would suggest, in terms of the actual writing, is to always use short declarative sentences. Don't get into the business of writing long, wordy things, which is typically what many writers, no matter what level of experience, will typically do. Simple declarative sentences will help you explain to yourself, first and foremost, what it is you're trying to do. Secondly, I would suggest that you use the active voice as opposed to the passive voice. There's a time and place for the passive voice. I'm not one of these people who say we should kill the passive voice, nor am I one of these people who say that's the standard for scientific objective writing. It's not. And anybody who tells you it's a mandate is really leading you down the wrong path. There's a time and place for the passive voice, but you should start with the active voice, because it's much easier to get done what you need to get done. I would also recommend that you use the present tense, the simple present tense, in the gap or the problem section of the abstract, and also in the part of the abstract about what the project is trying to do or does. I would use the past tense in the methodology section. This study used a randomized controlled approach, or this study was blah, 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 that kind of thing. But when you're referring to the calculations or the measurements, then I would switch back to the present tense. I would use past or present in the results section, although the past tense is the more common tense to use in the results section. Or you could do a mixture of the two, especially when facts become more like truths. And then when you get to your conclusion, I would say present perfect, has brought, has developed, has formulated, that kind of thing can be very appropriate there. Otherwise, use the simple present tense. So these are the kind of, again, strategies, moves, techniques, whatever you want to call them, that you will see in the most successful abstract writing out there. And finally, abstract writing is a challenge. There's no two ways about it. Abstracts are not introductions, and they are not linear, and they are not summary. There's something else. They're descriptions, they're abstractions from some source. They are products of information reduction, condensation, whatever you want to call them. They're very brief and concise. They usually follow very set patterns, which is a good thing. And as the gentleman said at the very beginning, they really do help you understand your project. Abstract writing can develop your writing muscles, your writing skills. They really can. you know, as writers, you've got to sort of exercise all of your writing muscles, short forms, long forms, in between forms, abstract, theoretical, concrete, hard data. It really is important if you're going to be a complete scientist or a complete professional to use all of your skills and abilities. And abstracts really do help you to become someone who can say things in a very concise way. So it's very important to your career. And that's the last point, that it really does matter. When people see the evidence of your ability to think critically or creatively, they sit up and take notice. So these are things that are very, very important. When you get first started on writing an abstract, don't worry about word limit, really. You should try to write everything that you think is important that needs to be said first, and later on you can remove words and sentences that aren't essential. And going back to the keywords, again, go to those examples that I have on these slides and look at them and think, okay, what are the keywords in these versions of abstracts? What are the phrases and words that would turn up in a search? And use that as part of the information as you think about your own abstract writing. It's going to be slightly less technical than your actual study, these keywords, but they will be very, very important in terms of the writing. So what do you guys think about including abbreviations in an abstract? Should you do it? Should you not do it? Any thoughts?
Over here. I think it makes it kind of inaccessible to laymen, but if you're trying, it depends on your audience you're presenting to. Because I know when I've looked for articles for class and I'm not got a solid handle on the abbreviations, it can be very confusing to know what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I agree. Anybody else? Do you come across them often in your research? Yeah, they're pretty ubiquitous. I think the point is well taken. If you're dealing with something that is very universal in a particular field, like COPD, I think almost everybody in healthcare, because that abbreviation has become so ubiquitous, so universal. I think if you're dealing with something like that, you can include the abbreviation in your abstract. But the more rare or the more unusual is probably going to cause problems in terms of the reader comprehension. And definitely, if you were submitting to a conference, it might be the basis for them to reject you out of hand. They would draw the conclusion that you don't know how to communicate with your audience by using jargon, by using abbreviations that are not familiar to most people. So in general, I would say don't use them unless, again, they are something highly recognizable. And if you are going to use an abbreviation, don't use it more than a couple of times in an abstract. It's really important to follow the instructions. So basically, committees work on the same basis as editors at a journal. So they have you guys heard of the phrase desk reject? So that's when something comes across their desk, they look at it immediately to see, is it conforming to our instructions, to our guidelines? And if it doesn't, they don't even read a word of it, they reject it immediately. And a lot of writers, scholars send work and they just wait and wait and wait and they never hear anything, as if their work had gone into a black hole. And 9 times out of 10, it's because they did something wrong in terms of the instructions or guidelines, and it was desk rejected immediately. And they never get feedback from that kind of thing. So it's really vital that you follow the instructions to the T. That's essential. Never rush to completion your abstract. Again, that's another thing that can contribute to its failure. Always proofread very carefully. Get somebody that you know who has a very scrupulous eye to proofread your work before you submit. And again, that's another thing. Any typo, any error is magnified in the eyes of the evaluator, and it reflects poorly on you. They think that you're not someone who knows how to spell, or you're just not careful enough when it comes to double checking or triple checking your work. It's very important that you do that. And one of the tricks that I have done myself and that other writers do is when you're looking at a provisional draft of your abstract, try pretending that one line or one phrase is not there, or actually delete it from the draft, and to see how the information comes across to you or doesn't come across to you if you delete something, some piece of information like that. What does that deletion or the disappearance do for you as a reader? I think if you do little tricks like that, it can help you sort of begin to see the significance of the way the information is affecting this stranger who will be reading your work. You know, the last thing I would say, again, like I said at the top, I think that the skills and the principles and the concepts that go into research apply directly to the writing of research, from the full-blown paper all the way down to the little abstract. I think that it really does focus the reader's mind on how you have carried out your work, what you found, what were the implications or significance of what you found, clear, direct communication, adherence to instructions, careful editing. All of this helps to produce a really high quality abstract that totally increases your chances of getting it accepted. And that's the start of a whole new storehouse of opportunities. Any questions that I could answer while we still have a little bit of time today? Well,
I have a question.
sure.
So for my research, mine pertains to medicinal tobacco plants. So would you put that as informational or descriptive?
I'm sorry, we got a bad connection. Could you repeat your question?
So my project is about medicinal tobacco plants, and I was wondering, would that fall under descriptive or informative?
What are you trying to what are you trying to get at with this project?
I just say it was more informative because I like inform mainly the community members back at my reservation, but also I'm also describing like parts of the tobacco plant, like like the biology of these plants, as well as, you know, informing.
If it is mostly informative, if it is mostly going to be like, here's something we don't know about, it sounds to me at face value that yes, that would be more of a descriptive abstract rather than the other type.
Okay.
I always say, you know, you should, writing language should be like fashion. You should try it on. If it doesn't fit, take it off and put something else on. Try it out, you know. You should never just try to force, you know, a square peg through a round hole. You've got to try to find something that really does fit right for both the material and as well as for your own interests as a researcher and scholar.
Okay.
Any other questions? So, you know, again, you've got to plan a lot of time for research, whether you're hoping to get into a conference or whether you're hoping to get into a journal. It takes a lot of time, a lot of planning. And again, to prevent yourself from just getting tired, writers just get tired when they take projects on. The writing, the researching, the thinking can be exhausted. You've got to be very, very proactive in terms of, again, keeping this thing really moving with a kind of energy and the determination to get to the end. One scholar defined the phrase intellectual motive as simply being seeing a thing to its completion, getting things done instead of leaving things half done. And I think when it comes to research, you have to be oh so careful and oh so mindful of all of the pitfalls, but also of the really great rewards and benefits that come with completing something that hasn't been done before. You guys really are contributing to knowledge. You can't believe that there's nothing new under the sun. There's so much that's undiscovered. There's so much that's undiscovered and needs to be written up. It provides a way for people on the other side of the world to take a new look at something that they too have been struggling with for a long, long time. Whether it's diabetes, whether it's hypertension, whether it's stroke, traumatic brain injury, smoking, cancer, no matter what it is, Alzheimer's. There's so many frontiers that still need to be approached, much less broken through. Well, again, I thank you for your patience. I know this is not the most interesting of topics, but it is very, very important when you're doing the work that you guys have chosen to do. So again, thank you very much, and thank you, Sarah, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting
Good
to us.
luck. Good luck to all of you. I hope some of you end up here at the medical center. Wherever you end up, I wish you all the best. You really are. I don't get tired of saying this. You really are the hope for the future, because we need people in the medical field and the healthcare field so desperately. The future can be very grim, or it can be very bright, depending on what you guys do. So thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And like I said, we will put this recording on the website by next week. So if you would like to rewatch it, feel free. And I'll see you guys next month. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sarah.